All right. Hello, hello, hello. Hopefully your day is going well, and hopefully you guys are having a blessed day. I'm here just to kind of bring this factoring all together. So for the last week or two, we've been talking about factoring and how we want to talk about the idea of getting rewriting something along the lines of ax squared plus bx plus c as a product of two binomials or like a constant term in binomials. So what we are doing is, the reason why we talk about this is so that we can find values of x that make the equation true. So one of the big properties that exist in math today is something called the zero product property. I call it a does statement property, which talks about the idea that if I'm multiplying two things together, like a and b, and I'm supposed to get 0, what that means is that either a has to be 0 or b has to be 0. So when I'm multiplying two things together to get 0, there has to be at least one term that gets me 0. Okay? So looking at the example next to us, we have two factored out terms. Okay, two factored out trinomials. And what I want to do is I want to find what makes this 0 and what makes that 0. Because if I know that this is 0, 0 times whatever that is going to equal 0. So let's try to figure out what can I put in place of n that makes that 0. Now I could play the game of guess and check, and we did this with finding zeros of a function, and it was fun and it was exciting. Or there's another way for me to find out what makes that 0. And why don't I just say, hey, n plus 3 equals 0. By setting that equal to 0, I can find out what that n value is. So I'm going to subtract 3, and I subtract 3, and I get n to equal -3. So that means that if I put -3 into this, if I do -3 plus 3, and then 7 times -3 plus 1, I should get 0. I get 0 right there, which is awesome. I get -21 plus 1, and that's -20. Well, if I do -20 times 0, what do I get? I get 0. Okay, so the same thing works with 7n plus 1. All I have to do is set that binomial equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 1, and I get 7n to equal -1. I'm going to divide both sides by 7, and I get n to equal -1 over 7. Okay? So that's how I find out what n equals. Let's try another one, and then I'm going to jump into like the meat and potatoes of today. So I want to figure out what makes that 0, so I'm going to set p minus 6 equal to 0, and I'm also going to do the same thing with 2p plus 1. I'm going to set those equal to 0. So I'm going to add 6, I get p to equal +6. And then if I do this one, I get -1 on both sides. I get 2p equals -1. I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So I get p to equal -1/2. And I'm going to also get p to be 6. Those are the things that make it true. So let's look at this one right here. I want to figure out what can I do to make this 0. Okay, so when I solve them, the first thing I want to do is I want to get one side equal to 0. Okay, so when I do this, let's look at this problem right here. Let's use my fancy little pen. I have a 3m squared, and I have a 2m squared. And which one's bigger? That one's bigger. So I'm going to try to get the 2m squared on this side. So I'm going to subtract 2m squared from both sides. Okay, and while I'm doing that, I'm trying to get this side to equal 0, so I'm going to add 8m to both sides, and I'm just going to subtract 10. So that totally gets this left side equal to 0, because everything cancels. So 3 minus 2, these are like terms, so I end up with 1m squared. -7 plus 8 gets me 1m, and then -10 minus 10 gets me -20. So once I do that, once I get one side to be 0, my next step would then to be factoring. So I want to factor this quantity right here. Okay, so I want to figure out what does that factor out to be. And we talked about the idea that we can multiply 1 times -20, and we're trying to find a product of -20, but a sum of 1. Well, that's going to probably be 5 and -4 gets me a product of -20 and a sum of 1. So we'll make our little box. I'm going to put m squared minus 20 or whatever method you guys use to factor. And then we'll factor out the greatest common factor. Right here it's m. Between those two it's m. Between those two it's +5. and then between those two is negative 4. So it looks like my factored form is m minus 4 and then m plus 5. So what do we do next? Well, we got one side to be 0, we factored, and then we want to set each binomial equal to 0. So I'm going to set m minus 4 equal to 0 and m plus 5 equal to 0 and solve it. So it means I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So I get m to be positive 4. I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides, and I get m to be negative 5. So there's two solutions to this, m equals 4 and m equals negative 5. So let's try this one. Step 1 is to get one side to be 0. I look here, I have negative 2 and I have negative 9. Negative 2 is bigger, so I'm going to add 9x squared. I don't like negatives, so I'm going to try to stay away from negatives. I'm going to subtract 5x from both sides. I'm going to add 16 to both sides. So when I do that, this side becomes 0. I end up with 7x squared minus 23x plus 6. Now we're going to factor it. 7 times 6 is 42. And I'm looking for a sum of negative 23. So what gets me 42? Like I know 6 and 7, 21 and 2. And if I add those two together, I get positive 23. So if I make those negative, I'm going to get negative 23. So that's what it works out to be. So I'm going to make my box and factor it by grouping or factoring it by a box method. And I'm going to put 7x squared here. I'm going to put plus 16 over here. I'm going to put negative 21 right here. And then I'm going to put a minus 2. And I realize that's a plus 6. I'm going to make that a plus 6, not a 16. That's a plus 6. Okay. So what goes into 7x squared and negative 2x? That's just an x. What goes into negative 21 and 6? That's a minus 3. What goes into 7 and 21 is a 7. They both have an x, so I can take one out. What goes into negative 2 and 6 is negative 2. So I factored, and I got 7x minus 2, and then x minus 3. So I factored. Now I'm going to set each equal to 0. 7x minus 2 equal to 0. X minus 3 equal to 0. So I get x to be positive 3. Add 2 to both sides because I'm getting x totally by itself. And I get x to 7x equal 2. Divide both sides by 7. And I get x to be 2/7. Those are my two solutions. I'm going to ask you guys to try the next few problems. When you're done, let me know and I can check them.